If you take a room full of high school valedictorians, right, and then a room full of solid, middle-of-the-pack, C-average students, the statistics tell a very funny story.
They really do. Fast forward 10 or 15 years, and you often find those C students managing the valedictorians.
Exactly,
Yeah.
because we spend, what, the first 2 decades of our lives relentlessly graded on this highly specific type of cognitive performance. You fill out the Scantron bubble sheet, you calculate the trajectory of the train leaving Chicago, you memorize the periodic table.
Right. It is all incredibly measurable.
Yeah, and society basically hands you a golden ticket if your brain operates like a supercomputer. You get the A+, you get into the prestigious university, you get the fancy job title, but then you hit the real world.
And suddenly that golden ticket doesn't seem to clear the path anymore.
Nah.
It's the great paradox of modern achievement, really. We operate under this assumption that raw processing power guarantees a smooth life trajectory.
But it doesn't.
No, it doesn't. The data constantly shows a massive disconnect between academic brilliance and actual life satisfaction.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we all know that person, the absolute genius from college who wrecked the grading curve for the rest of us. But you look them up years later, and they're struggling. They bounce from job to job, their interpersonal life is chaotic, and they just cannot seem to navigate the friction of everyday reality. Meanwhile, the person who sat in the back, grinding out B-minuses, is out there thriving. They're leading a massive organization and seemingly winning at life.
Yeah, it's a very common scenario.
So why does being objectively smart consistently fail to guarantee success? Today on The Deep Dive, we have a mission. We are examining a comprehensive review of Daniel Goleman's highly influential work, Emotional Intelligence, to figure out why the traditional IQ test has been giving us an incomplete picture of human potential for over a century.
What's fascinating here is the sheer academic disruption Goleman's work caused when it first entered the mainstream. For generations, our culture essentially worshipped at the altar of IQ.
Right, like it was the only thing that mattered.
Exactly. The cognitive intelligence quotient was viewed as this ultimate fixed metric. You were born with a certain amount of cognitive horsepower, and that was your destiny. But the source material we are dissecting today dismantles that entirely.
Completely tears it down.
It does. Goleman introduces emotional intelligence, or EQ, which is the ability to recognize, understand, manage, and influence emotions in yourself and others. And the research presents a rigorous data-backed case that EQ is actually the defining variable for career longevity, effective leadership, and stable relationships.
Which requires a massive paradigm shift. Because, when most people hear the word emotions, they think of something abstract and cloudy.
Like it's not real science.
Yeah. We treat feelings like art or poetry as something separate from the hard, calculating machinery of the brain. But before we can even begin to talk about the psychology of improving our EQ, we have to look at the biology.
We really do. The physical battlefield inside our heads.
Because our emotions don't just happen to us magically. They are highly calibrated physiological events. And the source goes deep into the science here, focusing on a literal tug-of-war happening inside our skulls between two very different systems, the neocortex and the amygdala.
And understanding that biological architecture is non-negotiable if you want to grasp Goleman's premise. The neocortex is the rational brain. In evolutionary terms, it is the newest piece of hardware we possess.
So that's the logical side.
Yes. This is where your logical thinking, your long-term planning, and your complex analysis live. When you are building a financial model or strategizing for a negotiation, your neocortex is firing.
Okay.
But resting much deeper in the brain is the amygdala. This is the ancient emotional brain. It has been around since we were dodging predators on the savannah, and it is entirely responsible for fear, anger, and your basic hardwired survival instincts.
So the amygdala is essentially the brain's alarm system.
A highly sensitive, incredibly fast alarm system. And that speed is where the vulnerability lies. Because the amygdala is designed to keep you alive in life or death situations, it has privileged neurological access to the brain's sensory inputs.
Wait, really? It gets the signal first?
It does. When your eyes see something or your ears hear something, the signal actually reaches the amygdala milliseconds before it reaches the neocortex.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This biological reality leads to a phenomenon the source identifies as the amygdala hijack. This is the exact moment your emotional brain reacts to a trigger. and literally cuts power to your rational brain before logic has a chance to intervene.
Let me try to put a visual on this because it helps to see the mechanics. Instead of looking at it like a struggle between two people, what if we look at it like modern aviation?
Okay, I like where this is going.
So if the neocortex is the highly trained pilot flying a commercial jet, slow, calculating, going through a complex checklist, the amygdala isn't an intruder. It's the plane's automated emergency collision system. It's designed to override the pilot's controls if it senses a mountain. But the problem is, the amygdala is operating on ancient software. So the automated system sees a dark cloud, misinterprets it as a solid mountain, and violently throws the plane into a nosedive to avoid a threat that doesn't actually exist.
That is exactly it.
And the pilot, your logical brain, is just sitting there helpless, waiting for the system to release the controls.
That captures the mechanism much more accurately than just calling it a loss of temper.
Yeah.
The amygdala forces an evasive maneuver based on a false positive.
Like getting a stressful text message.
Yes, your boss sends an email that says, "We need to talk." And your ancient brain doesn't see a modern corporate communication. It sees a lion in the tall grass. Your heart rate spikes, adrenaline floods your system, and before the neocortex can say, "It's probably just about the quarterly report," you've already fired back a defensive, highly destructive email that you will regret an hour later.
Because the pilot was locked out.
Precisely. Recognizing this timeline is the very first step toward emotional intelligence. You stop viewing your irrational moments as inherent character flaws, and you start seeing them as biological overrides.
That is such a relief, honestly.
It is. The source drives home a vital realization here. Emotions are just data points. They are information about your environment. They are not enemies, but they also shouldn't be allowed to fly the plane unsupervised.
Which brings us to the core challenge of Goleman's work. If we are biologically hardwired for the automated collision system to react first, how do we prevent these false alarms from torpedoing our careers and our relationships?
Well, the source lays out a framework of 5 EQ components to help with exactly that.
Starting with 3 that are entirely internal, right?
Correct. And the absolute bedrock of this framework is self-awareness. Without self-awareness, the rest of the framework simply collapses.
But we need to define what self-awareness actually means in a neurological context, rather than just treating it like a self-help buzzword.
Exactly. It is the real-time ability to observe your own amygdala lighting up.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, a person with low self-awareness gets cut off in traffic, walks into their morning meeting, and snaps at a junior employee. If you ask them why they are acting that way, they will rationalize it by saying, "My team is incompetent today."
So they are entirely blind to the actual source of their anger.
Completely blind to their physiological arousal.
Mm-hmm.
But a person with high self-awareness feels the exact same adrenaline spike. But their neocortex is trained to step back and observe the machinery. They think, "My chest is tight, my heart is racing, I am experiencing residual anger from my commute, and I need to compartmentalize this before I speak to my team."
So it's essentially developing the cognitive muscle to watch the collision alarm go off without letting it take over the steering column.
That's a great way to put it.
But just recognizing the alarm isn't enough to turn it off. That requires the second internal component, which the source calls self-regulation. This is where we actually intervene. And I'm curious about the mechanism here.
How do we do it?
Yeah. How does a person actually self-regulate when their brain chemistry is screaming at them to attack or run away?
This is where we move from observation to tactical intervention. Self-regulation relies heavily on physiological state breaks to buy time for the neocortex to boot back up.
So physically changing what your body is doing.
Exactly. The source discusses the manager who receives an incredibly unfair piece of criticism. The amygdala demands immediate retribution, but the highly self-regulated manager forces a delay.
They don't just reply immediately.
No, they might take a slow, deep breath, which physically signals the parasympathetic nervous system to slow the heart rate. They might literally walk away from their desk to change their physical environment. They are actively managing the expression of the emotion rather than suppressing it entirely.
And that builds a habit over time.
More than a habit, it builds neurological infrastructure. Every time you successfully pause during an amygdala hijack, you are physically strengthening the neural pathways between your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala. You are upgrading the software so the pilot can regain control faster next time.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the first 2 components, awareness and regulation, feel very defensive. They are about preventing disaster.
Right, stopping the crash.
But the third internal component the source highlights is motivation. Goleman argues that emotionally intelligent people are driven by internal goals, like a sense of purpose, mastery, and personal growth, rather than external rewards like money or prestige.
Yes, the internal drive.
But I have to push back on this. If we look at the real world, at Fortune 500 CEOs, elite athletes, the people operating at the absolute peak of their fields, it seems incredibly naive to suggest they aren't motivated by the massive salaries and the status. Isn't the pursuit of those external rewards the very definition of high achievement?
I get why you'd say that. It is easy to look at the visible outcomes, the wealth and the titles, and assume that is the fuel. But the data in the source draws a sharp distinction between what gets someone into the game and what sustains their cognitive endurance when the game becomes brutal.
Okay, so the money might start the engine, but it doesn't keep it running.
Exactly. External motivators are neurologically fragile. If you are entirely motivated by the prospect of $1 million bonus, what happens to your performance the moment the market crashes and that bonus is taken off the table?
Your drive just completely evaporates.
It vanishes. The source points out that top-tier performers possess a resilient form of motivation. They have a genuine, almost obsessive curiosity about their craft. They find the problem-solving process itself rewarding.
So the external reward is just a byproduct of an internal engine that never shuts off.
Precisely. When failure hits, the internally motivated person looks at the failure as a puzzle to be solved, whereas the external motivated person sees it as a signal to quit.
Wow.
And the most crucial point Goleman makes about all three of these internal skills, awareness, regulation, and motivation, is neuroplasticity.
That we can change them.
Right. Unlike your raw IQ, which generally plateaus by late adolescence, your emotional intelligence is incredibly malleable. You can myelinate those neural pathways and literally rewire your emotional responses at 40, 50, or 80 years old.
That drastically changes the narrative that you are just permanently stuck with the temper or the anxiety you had in your 20s.
You are definitely not stuck.
So let's assume we have secured our own cockpit. We have the internal framework functioning. The problem is human beings don't operate in a vacuum. We are constantly flying in formation with other people.
A lot of other planes in the sky.
Yeah, and if you can control your own amygdala, but you have no idea what is triggering the collision alarms of your colleagues or your spouse, you are still going to crash.
Absolutely.
And that moves us to the outer impact of Goleman's work, which covers the final two components: empathy and social skills.
This is where emotional intelligence scales from personal stability to interpersonal influence. Empathy is fundamentally the ability to read the emotional currents of another person. It is recognizing their amygdala triggers.
And the source makes a pretty bold claim about this regarding the workplace, doesn't it?
It makes a very bold, heavily researched claim. Empathy is arguably the most critical predictor of effective leadership.
Yeah.
It completely dismantles the old corporate idea that empathy is a soft, optional skill.
Like, oh, it's nice to have, but not required.
Right, but that's entirely wrong. If a leader cannot accurately perceive the emotional state of their workforce, they are flying blind. They won't understand why a new initiative is facing massive resistance, or why their top performer is suddenly disengaged.
I mean, the genius with the 150 IQ might draft a flawless, mathematically perfect reorganization strategy, but if they lack empathy, they will present that strategy in a way that makes the entire team feel like obsolete cogs in a machine.
Exactly.
And then the strategy fails, not because the math was wrong, but because the leader triggered a collective amygdala hijack across their entire department, which means the brilliant strategy never actually gets executed.
And the tactical application of avoiding that is what Goleman defines as social skills. It is not just about being charismatic or giving a good presentation. Social skills in the context of EQ involve the active de-escalation of other people's emotional states.
Like conflict resolution.
Take conflict resolution, for example. When an employee makes a critical error and is called into the office, their amygdala is already firing. They are expecting a threat.
Their collision alarm is already blaring.
Yes. An emotionally intelligent leader uses social skills to validate the employee's fear, first, signaling that they are safe before addressing the logical error. They calm the other person's biological alarm system so that the employee's neocortex can actually process the feedback.
Because you can't reason with an active amygdala.
You really can't. And this specific insight completely revolutionized corporate leadership training when the book was published. Companies finally understood why promoting their smartest, highest IQ individual contributors to management was causing absolute disaster.
Leading a team requires a fundamentally different operating system than writing brilliant code or analyzing data. But this dynamic isn't restricted to the boardroom, is it?
Not at all.
The source spends significant time applying this biological framework to our personal lives, marriages, friendships, parenting. It points out that relationship breakdowns are rarely the result of simple logical disagreements over facts.
No, they're almost always failures of emotional management.
Let's look at the classic domestic dispute. The massive relationship-threatening argument over someone loading the dishwasher incorrectly.
Oh, yes. The classic.
Logically, it makes no sense, but biologically, it's not a logistics debate about the angle of a plate, is it?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the dishwasher argument perfectly illustrates the collision of two unmanaged amygdalas. Person A sighs and rearranges the plates. Person B's amygdala registers that sigh not as a helpful adjustment, but as a direct attack on their competence and autonomy.
The collision alarm triggers.
Right. Person B snaps defensively. Then, person A's amygdala instantly perceives that defensive snap as a threat to their authority and respect.
And suddenly you have two ancient brains screaming at each other on the savannah, entirely divorced from the original context of the kitchen appliance.
Exactly. It's not about the dishes anymore.
So the EQ intervention there is the self-awareness to realize, I'm not furious about the silverware. My alarm system is reacting to feeling unappreciated. If you can articulate that deeper reality, you bypass the defensive loops entirely. You are literally hacking the matrix of human interaction.
That is the power of it.
But, we need to pause and do a reality check on the source material itself. So what does this all mean? If Goleman's framework is this incredibly potent blueprint for human interaction, we have to ask why everyone hasn't simply read the book and become emotionally flawless. We need to examine the limitations of the text as highlighted in the review.
And the review is quite pragmatic about the book's shortcomings. The primary critique is that Goleman's original text is exceptionally dense.
It's a tough read.
It is essentially an academic thesis that crossed over into the mainstream. It spends an enormous amount of time detailing the highly specific neural pathways and the brain chemistry involved in emotion.
Right. If you are trying to read this on a commuter train after a 10-hour workday, the detailed geography of the thalamus is probably going to put you to sleep.
For a modern reader who just wants to improve their life, wading through pages of dense neuroanatomy can severely stall the pacing of the book.
And it seems like modern audiences have very different expectations for self-improvement literature now. We are conditioned to look for bulleted lists, 5 hacks to instantly control your temper. But the source notes that Goleman doesn't really provide those step-by-step, actionable, daily exercises.
No, he doesn't. And this raises an important question about how our culture views behavioral change. We have developed a severe addiction to quick fixes and immediate life hacks.
We want the shortcut.
But human neurology doesn't operate like a quick software patch that you can install over the weekend. The reason Goleman's work maintains its status as a foundational, highly rated text is precisely because it provides the deep underlying architecture.
You have to know how it works.
Exactly. You cannot permanently alter a complex machine if you refuse to understand how the gears turn. While the text might lack a convenient 30-day workbook, it definitively proves that emotional intelligence is a trainable skill. It hands the reader the biological blueprint, but it demands that the reader take full responsibility for designing their own daily practice.
The review does offer a helpful workaround, though. It heavily advocates for the audiobook format, noting that hearing the material spoken aloud softens the academic density.
That's a great point.
The complex science feels much more like a conversation, and the storytelling elements land better, which drastically improves retention compared to just fighting through the text on a page.
Which is a very practical solution for accessing the material. But ultimately, the burden of application remains. The knowledge only becomes power when it is actively practiced in the friction of real life.
You can listen to the most brilliant lecture on the biomechanics of lifting weights, but you still have to go to the gym and lift the heavy things yourself.
Exactly. You have to do the work.
And that reality really brings us full circle on this entire deep dive. We started by looking at the mystery of the paper genius, the person with the towering IQ who somehow falters in the real world. The core takeaway from Goleman's research provides the missing puzzle piece.
It really does.
IQ might get you the interview. It provides the baseline cognitive processing power to do the math and analyze the data. But EQ builds the house. It determines how far you can travel once you are actually in the room. We've seen how our ancient biology sets invisible traps for us, how our automated systems hijack our logic before we even realize we are angry. We've seen how practicing self-awareness physically rewires the brain, and how empathy is the ultimate tactical advantage in leadership.
The source distills the paradigm shift into a single truth processing power simply isn't enough. The ability to master the internal climate of your own mind while skillfully navigating the emotional climates of others is the true metric of human capability.
And as we wrap up our time today, I want to leave you with something to consider as you head back into your own life. We know that emotional intelligence is the dominant factor in predicting a successful, fulfilling life. And we know that unlike raw IQ, it is highly trainable. It's a biological skill that can be developed.
It takes time, but it can be done.
So think about the implications for the future. What would happen to our society if our educational systems actually absorbed this data?
That's a fascinating thought.
What if, instead of only drilling algebraic equations and historical dates, schools approached emotional regulation training with the exact same rigor and funding as mathematics? Imagine a future workforce, a generation of future leaders and future partners who were systematically taught how to recognize an amygdala hijack before it destroys a relationship or a company.
It would change everything.
It makes you wonder what kind of world we could actually build if we spent as much time training the pilot as we do testing the plane. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. It is always a privilege to explore these massive concepts with you. Stay curious, keep an eye on your automated collision system today, and we will catch you on the next one.